Kaireta Mathetai. In this video, I'll tell you how the conditions work in Greek and how you form them in Greek. So in the last video, I talked about the way the conditions work in English, 0 type, type 1, type 2, and type 3. And I said there's a corresponding system of classifying them in Greek. So the general truth kind of condition, which we called 0 type in English, has a corresponding general conditions type in Greek. In Greek, you can do this both in present, if it rains I stay inside, and you can also do it in the past, which doesn't technically have a type in English, but you can make general conditions in the past. So if it rained, I used to say stay inside indicates a generalized conditional truth that happens in the past. For probable results, we have what is referred to as the future more vivid kind of condition, and that is actually quite a lot like the general truth type of condition, but it is placing its result in the future. So if it rains I will cry can't be a general truth because the future hasn't happened yet, but we're very confident about the possibility of it happening. Type 2, which is much more hypothetical, remember, and if it rained I would cry might indicate something that is kind of hypothetical and doesn't have, we're not kind of deciding whether it's going to happen or not. Maybe it's going to rain, maybe it's not going to rain, but if it did rain I would cry. And this is indicated in Greek by what's called the future less vivid condition, contrasted with future more vivid, about which you're confident. But if it rained I would cry also in English might be construed as something contrafactual. So if you say if it rained I would cry, that might indicate it's not raining and so I'm not crying. A more precise way of doing that in English would be to use the formulation, if it were raining, I would be crying. And then you know for a fact that you're in a contrafactual situation. So we have a sharp distinction in Greek between the hypothetical, future less vivid, and the present contrafactual. And then you also have past contrafactuals. So if it had rained, I would have cried. And that corresponds to a past contrafactual in Greek. Okay, so we have general, present and past conditions, future more vivid, future less vivid, present contrafactual, and past contrafactual, for a total of 6 different kinds of conditions in Greek. And one way to think about the 6 conditions is to split them in half between real ones, which are either general truths or very probable, and the real ones will correspond to types 0 and 1 in English. In the past, this would be the past general. If ever we sacrificed, they always sent gifts. In the present, the type 0 present general, if she sacrifices, they send gifts. And then in the future, the very probable one, if she sacrifices, they will send gifts. So think about those 3 in contrast to the next 3. Okay, so the second 3 types of conditions you can think about as removed from the truth, more hypothetical or indeed unreal. So in the past, we know for a fact, because it's already happened, that this is contrafactual. If they had sacrificed, she would have sent gifts. In the present, you can do one that's also contrary to fact. If I were a bell, I'd be ringing, but I'm not, so I'm not. But when you get into the future, right, you can't really have something that's contrary to fact, because the future hasn't happened yet, so you don't know what's contrary to fact. So instead of a future version of the contrafactual, instead you have this hypothetical formulation, which in Greek we call the future less vivid. Now, another way that you will hear the future less vivid talked about is the should-would formulation, okay? And that it gets talked about that way because in weird translationese it will be translated that way. If I should win the lottery, I would buy a house. In fact, you will never hear people saying that in modern American English. What they would say really is, if I won the lottery, I would buy a house. Okay? But again, that formulation is ambiguous because it might be present contrafactual, but it might be this hypothetical future formulation. If I were to win the lottery, I would buy a house. Or if you're Coldplay, if I lay here, if I just lay here, would you lie with me and just forget the world? So, just in case you've forgotten, I will repeat my warning in English. The present contrafactual and the hypothetical or future less vivid can be identical in form. And that form is if past tense, then conditional. If I won the lottery, I would be rich. If I had $1 million, I would buy you a house. If you want to make a very clearly present contrafactual kind of a condition, you use the formulation were Xing. Okay, and you can maybe see this in the contrast between these two sentences. She wouldn't know what to do if she saw a squirrel. That's kind of hypothetical. We don't know whether she's seeing a squirrel or not, but if she saw one, she wouldn't know what to do. Versus, she wouldn't know what to do if she were looking at one. Okay, and that sentence lets you know that she is not, in fact, right now looking at one. We are, of course, talking about my dog, Pippi. Okay, so now we've been through the 4 types in English. We've been through the more nuanced set of 6 types in Greek. And now we're ready to talk about how you make them in Greek. We'll start with the general real conditions, okay? And as I said, we can do this in the past and the present and the future. In the past, you use a plus the optative in the protasis, the if clause, and then you use the imperfect indicative in the apodosis or main clause. The optative, the tense of the optative, remember, only indicates aspect. So the difference between a thuoi and present optative and a thusai aorist optative is simply the aspect. Okay, so if ever she was sacrificing, if you got a present optative, if ever she sacrificed, if you have an aorist optative, I always sent gifts. Okay, that's a recurring truth in the past. When you do this same formulation in the present, what you use is now the subjunctive and the present indicative in the apodosis. And this, if you think about it, makes a certain amount of sense because the optative generally tends to show up in secondary sequence, and a past general condition is using an imperfect in the main clause, so it's in secondary sequence. A present general condition is in primary sequence. It's using a present indicative in the main clause. So here you get the subjunctive instead of the optative. But there's this further condition, I'm sorry, a further distinction between the present general and the past general, and that's with the little word that it's introduced with. So instead of a for if, you get the particle on in the present general condition. So on in the subjunctive, present indicative. If ever she sacrifices, he always sends gifts. Once again, the distinction between the present subjunctive and the aorist subjunctive is simply one of aspect, progressive versus aoristic aspect. And then finally, if you flip this real or very probable style of condition into the future, you get what in Greek is called the future more vivid. And here again, it's identical to the present general in the protasis, aon plus the subjunctive. It's the same way you started off, but now, because we're talking about the future, instead of it having a present indicative in the apodosis, you get the future indicative in the apodosis. So ean thue or ean thuse, if she's sacrificing, dora pempse, he will send gifts. Okay? So you can kind of see a pattern in the way those 3 real or probable conditions work. Then if you turn to the unreal or contrafactual or else hypothetical conditions, and again, if we start in the past, we start with the past contrafactual, and here, because you actually know that this didn't happen, it kind of enters the world of fact, and so you don't use the subjunctive or operative, you use only the indicatives in the contrafactuals. And you use, for the past contrafactual, the aorist indicative in both the protasis and the apodosis. So A plus the aorist indicative in the protasis, and the aorist indicative plus this important particle on in the apodosis. That's your indicator that you're in a contrafactual context. So A, ethysen epempsan andora, if she had sacrificed, they would have sent gifts. But she didn't, so they didn't, okay? That's the past version. In the present version, this is confusing, what's used is the imperfect indicative, okay? So A plus the imperfect indicative in the protasis, imperfect indicative plus on in the apodosis. So note that the past contrafactual and the present contrafactual are almost identical in the way you put them together, except that you use the aorist in the past and the imperfect in the present. And again, the clearest way to indicate this in English is to use were Xing in the protasis and then the conditional in the apodosis. If she were sacrificing, they would be sending gifts. But frankly, when you hear people do this in real speech, the way they normally formulate this present contrafactual is just to use a past tense in the if clause and the conditional in the then clause. If she sacrificed, they would send gifts. And then the future version of this, again, as I said, it can't be contrafactual because there isn't really fact in the future. But the more hypothetical version is called the future less vivid. That's what FLV stands for. And you do that one using A plus the optative mood in the protasis and the optative plus on in the apodosis. So like the present and like the past and the present, you get on in the apodosis of each of these. But because you're now hypothetical, you're using the optative mood for both the protasis and the apodosis of the future less vivid. So a thuoi pempoidora, if she should sacrifice, he would send gifts, or if she sacrificed, he would send gifts. So here's the overview, and this is slightly different from the way that these conditions are presented by Hansen and Quinn, but I think it allows you to see the patterns more easily if you think of them as either unreal or hypothetical. In the past, that's past contrafactual, A plus aorist plus on. In the present contrafactual, A plus imperfect plus on. In the future, that's the future less vivid, that's the less certain future, A plus optative plus on. And those are contrasted with the much more real or probable ones, which gives you in the past the past general A plus optative with the imperfect in the apodosis, in the present A on plus subjunctive with the present in the apodosis, and then in the future the more certain version of the future A on plus the subjunctive and the future indicative in the apodosis. So they're tricky to remember, but they're very, very common and very important to learn. And if you want to, there's one final video on ways to translate them both from English to Greek and Greek to English.